For UN correspondent for Radio Radicale in Rome, and also the editor-in-chief for La Voce di New York. And today we're presenting, and again, thank you for UNCA that is hosting this event. Today we present the book of Professor Manlio Graziano. The book, the English title is A Holy War, A Holy Alliance, Religions, International Disorder in the 21st Century. Columbia University Press. It will be published in January 2016. The book came out already in Italy. You can see it. In Italian title is Guerra Santa e Santa Alleanza. And I present in few words the Professor Graziano. Professor Graziano teaches international relations and geopolitics in several universities in Paris and in Geneva. You have his bio here. I don't want to take too much time. I'm proud to say that he writes also for very important magazines. One is, for example, Limes, that he's very much his columns, because we think that those, when we read about geopolitics, you need the people that are independent. You need people that don't have any at stake. You don't have something there to support or not support. In the case of Professor Graziano, is an analyst that with an expertise on the geopolitics of religions, but not only talks. He's an expertise on the Middle East, on Turkey, on Russia. I saw him writing about a lot of things, and today he's going to talk in particular about this book. And in the book will be introduced by Brian Knowlton, that he's a former correspondent for the New York Times. He was with the Herald International Tribune in Paris, and then he moved here in Washington, and he's going to introduce the ideas that are behind this book, and then we will give the word to Professor Graziano. It is very important, the floor here. I mean, we are here actually to wait for you, for your questions. That will make the evening very interesting. Please.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Stefano, for that introduction. Yeah, I am the translator of Manlio's latest book, and before that of two of his other books, including The Failure of Italian Nationhood. We'll get a plug-in for that as well. I've always been struck by the expansiveness of his thinking, by his thoughtfulness, the originality of his work, and his latest book continues in that vein. Let me, by the way, apologize for using my notes. When I started going through his latest book to remind myself of some of the ideas that I wanted to mention today, I started going through and copying and pasting them into a separate file, which I then printed out, and it came out to 28 pages. And my wife, who used to coach French executives in giving successful and effective public presentations, said no. She said, put it all on a 3x5 note card. I didn't quite manage that, but Manlio is much more efficient. That's his notes, but then he knows this. Anyway, all of this, you know, comes at a particularly interesting time. I think his book is extremely well timed, you know, with the tangled interactions of religion and geopolitics in the world. Just in the time he was writing the book, religion was used as a pretext to justify or glorify political and military confrontations in Mali, Nigeria, the Central African Republic, Kenya, Iraq, Burma, Sri Lanka, India, even Ukraine. It's been an obviously central feature of the Arab Spring and all of the messy aftermath there. Manlio provides some really useful myth busting. You know, setting some truth on questions of religion, religious violence, Islam, Catholicism. There's a lot of territory covered, and he does it really compellingly. just quickly, I'm just going to hit a few themes. He focuses on the resurgence of religion in the public square in the Middle East and elsewhere, and this at a time of relative decline in the long dominant economic powers in the world. He points out that even in the United States, religion has become imbued in political campaigns. Barack Obama mentioned the word God in his campaign more often than any modern presidential candidate in history. The Catholic profile has risen interestingly in this country. As he points out, there are now 6 of the 9 members of the Supreme Court are Catholic. 40% of the state governors are Catholic, even though the U.S. population is somewhere around 20% Catholic. The combination of politics and religion is always interesting, and I'm quite interested to see how some of the Republican candidates for president, whether Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or others, will be responding. Some have already responded to Pope Francis's comments on climate change. It's an interesting, there's all sorts of good stuff to talk about here. Manlio has much to say about how this new deeper involvement of religions in politics of the past 30 or 40 or 50 years was sort of overlooked for quite a while. When the Ayatollahs led the insurrection in Iran in 1978, many people reacted at first with disbelief or sarcasm. They didn't think this was a serious thing. When Henry Kissinger wrote his 1994 book, Diplomacy, 912 pages, he did not mention the Ayatollah Khomeini, who, as Manlio suggests, invented the identification between religious power and political power in modern times. He notes that modern terrorism is intrinsically secular, born as a weapon of nationalism, first of all in Christian countries. There was no Muslim terrorism before the Iranian Revolution of '79. Even now, Muslim terrorism appears largely nationalist, with, according to scholars he quotes, saying that the vast majority of suicide attacks aim above all to compel a democratic state to withdraw. He has much to say about how mainstream religions are adapting to the modern world. The return of religions to the public place depends largely on globalization, partly with its free movement of people and ideas, but also because of the existential uncertainties it's created and its failure to offer much of a path forward, which the sort of path that religions try to do. He quotes Olivier Roy as saying that fundamentalism is the religious form best adapted to globalization, which is an interesting thought. He also, of course, has much to say about Catholicism, this complexio oppositorum, is that pronounced correctly, or this complex of opposites which has found no antithesis it cannot embrace. He talks about the way the church managed during World War I at a time when it had millions of members on each side of the front lines to be both the ardently patriotic and bellicose church of different national clergies and the pacifistic church of the Roman center, and yet people seem to only remember the pacifistic comments that came from the Pope, right? And then very quickly, he talks about the way the church has evolved from speaking in official language in the past of the insidious Jews to referring to them as our older brothers and our fathers in faith. He talks about how Catholic leaders have gone in only a few decades from largely ignoring the Muslim world as weak and fragmented, neither a model nor a threat, to calling in Pope Benedict's words for an alliance of civilizations between the Western world and the Muslim world. And maybe that's enough for me to now throw it over to Manlio.
Yes, Manlio, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. That's wonderful because they told everything, so it's a good for me not to speak very long. Especially because when I start speaking in front of an audience in English, I always apologize first because I still belong to a generation of Italians who spent 5 years on the high school studying 5 hours Latin and 5 hours Greek, ancient Greek. and not 1 minute of English. So I had to make up in order to be able to talk with you today, and I'm not sure that I attained the result I wanted to attain. But in any case, they presented very well. I think your presentation was perfect. He said almost everything, so I have very, very little to add. Actually, I have one of the two papers I prepared is a quotation from a book I consider one of the best books written about political Islam in the last years. Is a book written by Graham Fuller, World Without Islam. I suggest you to read it because it's very complete. And in his book, among other things, Fuller says religions will always be invoked wherever it can to galvanize the public and to justify major campaigns, battles, and wars. But, he adds just a few lines later, the causes, campaigns, battles, and wars are not about religions. So, fundamentally, my book is an attempt to develop this idea. I am a specialist, as Stefano said, or I would like to be a specialist in international relations and geopolitics. So what I study, when I say I study geopolitics of religions, the stress is, of course, on geopolitics. I'm not a specialist in religions, I'm not a theologian, of course, but why it's so important to remind it today? Because I think that many of the battles, wars, causes of today are presented as a religious battle and conflict and struggles. And this is just one part of the thing. The other part, which is worse in my opinion, is that some people try to find a solution to these conflicts by religious means. And I think it's impossible to find a solution by religious means, because another book I read recently was very interesting by a scholar, professor in Georgetown, who studies and teaches the Bible, says that with the sacred text you can justify everything. And he is very interesting because he takes it's a book about religion in the American politics. And he says that quoting text of the Bible, he knows it very well, he can justify the fight against abortion and the pro-choice positions. As in the 19th century, they used the Bible to justify slavery and to fight against slavery. And it's exactly the same thing for all the topics, all the issues, the political issues. So we can say that the use of religions, of the sacred text in politics is a zero-sum policy, because you can say everything and the contrary of everything. So the problem is not, in my opinion, any problems caused by religions cannot be resolved by religion itself. We have to understand, to study what are the essential causes. As Fuller says, the causes, campaigns are not about religions. So we have to find what are they about. I finished writing this book in 2013. So when it will come out, here in the US, it will be already pretty old. I think I will need to add something. But I finished it in 1913, and it came out in Italy in January this year, just 1 week after the attacks in Paris. So, of course, the publisher was very happy, not for the attacks, but because it was a good, timely occasion to promote the book. But I didn't say anything about the attacks in Paris, didn't say anything about many things that happened after, and especially one of them is the emergence of ISIS, of course. There is nothing in the book about ISIS. But today, when I present this book everywhere, either in Italy or wherever in the world, in France or wherever in the world, I always say something about ISIS, because it's very, of course, it's very linked to what we are talking about, what I tried to talk about in this book. And the example is that the issue there in Syria and Iraq is a very, very political issue. In part is a military issue, but it's not a religious issue. I mean, what I studied is that religions are used for political purposes. And this is one of the cases in which religions are heavily used for political purposes. If we want to summarize in very, very short terms, is a fight between, it's very schematic, but just to have an idea, between Saudi Arabia and their allies on one side, and Iran and their allies on the other side. So it becomes very easily a fight between Shiism on one side and Sunnism in the other side. But we have to go further, because if we think that we can resolve this conflict going to study, examine, and discuss the differences between Shiism and Sunnism, we are sure that we'll never get out of this conflict. We have to study and to discuss what are the issues between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is the focus. This is why I insist on geopolitics of religion. Then, and I finish very rapidly, because the best part always when I present my book is the debate more than the presentation. As Brian said, there is a long part devoted to the Catholic Church. And this is for one reason. And the reason, again, I try to summarize very rapidly, because, of course, when the book is published in English, everybody will run in the bookstores for have this book and to see and to discover all what you didn't discover tonight. But to be very simple, on one side, there are the religions that I call, not in the book, but here, just for you, passive religions. And on the other side, there is one religion which is an active religion. What is the difference? The difference is that religions that don't have a leadership, a structure, an organization, a capability of producing their own strategies, I always speak in political terms, cannot have an active role in politics. They only have a passive role. So they are used. And of course, the first one that everybody talk about is the Sunni Islam. Because in the Sunni Islam, there is no a religious leadership. There is no one person or a group of persons who are allowed or entitled to express the official position of the Islam. This is the case of Sunni Islam. This is also the case of Hinduism, for example, for the same reasons. Because Hinduism is even more diverse, if you want, because it's not just a question of having 2 million of heads, but Hinduism itself is very changing. You can have some Hinduists who believe in some gods, others who believe in different gods, or Hinduists who believe in one god. So this is another case. Then you have a kind of intermediate space occupied by Christian churches that are not Catholic, because they have a leadership, but their range of action is limited. For example, you have a lot of national churches, and this is true also for the Orthodox churches. And then, on the other side, you have the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the only one which has a head, a government, and can send the official position everywhere in the world. So there is just one Catholic position. And I always make this example about two terrorist attacks that happened more or less at the same time. It was an American soldier, a Muslim American soldier from Palestinian origins, I guess, here in the US, who shot 13 of his colleagues, and in Texas, yeah. And more or less at the same time, there was Andres Breivik in Norway, who went to the island where there was this Congress of young socialists, and they started firing against them and made 69 victims. The soldier here, since he was a Muslim, became immediately an example of Muslim terrorism. Anders Breivik in Norway proclaimed himself Catholic. He said, I was raised Lutheran, but I decided to become Catholic because I think that Europe has to unite under one religious authority, and his authority is the Pope. So I am Catholic. No one spoke about Catholic terrorism. No one asked the Catholics all around the world to justify themselves or to take distances from these terrorists. Why? Because it's normal that nobody can claim, I did that because I'm Catholic, if it's not allowed by the Pope or by the official organisms of the Catholic Church. This is something that cannot happen in Islam, because in Islam everybody is has a direct relationship with God without an intermediate. There is no clergy. There are many scholars, but they are so many that they have different opinions about everything. So it's not possible to find one position. There is no one Muslim position, one is Muslim stance, which is different from the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has its own policy, and the policy of the Catholic Church today is the policy of gather together all the religions of the world, starting from the Christian religions, and in order to create what I called in the book this Holy Alliance. So there are different, we cannot treat all religions in the same way. We have to understand their history. I tried, the beginning of the book is essentially historical about the evolution of the presence of religions in politics. And the Catholic Church has necessarily a special part in this land, let's say. I had, of course, many other things to do, but I think it's better to stop here and to have a discussion with you, and so probably we can understand much better what.
Yes, it's, let's ask questions to Professor Graziano, and because I think what will be very interesting is that this is, as you understand, is a unique place. The United Nations Correspondents Association is because probably there are no other places in the world usually that you get a gathering of journalists from all over the world. Yes, you go in capitals where there are correspondents and there are association of foreign correspondents, but I think the way we cover the UN it makes it very interesting, not only to have situation that in this room we have all the time, no? Opposition leaders or people represented that they cannot talk at the UN because they don't let them, because they don't represent the country. They come here and they talk and we're listening, but we know that we're listening apart. I mean, somebody that has a big stake and is trying to support his own idea, whatever he's supporting. In the case of Professor Graziano, any scholars that come here, we have to understand that they can be right, they can be wrong, they can be closer to the truth, whatever, but they are independent scholars, and they come here just to inform us of what is their finding when they do research or they do analytical work, that is what they know how to do. And in this case, for us, I think, as a journalist, that we are here to try to do our best to get closer to the heart of the matter of the problem, is a big possibility. This is a big occasion to have a debate between the professor and us in trying to understand what they, what, I'm not talking only about ISIS, but in general, what is the big problem here at the moment that we have with this war that looks like is everywhere, and somebody's telling us there is a conflict here it is, the conflict of civilizations coming, was predicted 20 years ago. But apparently this book is saying something else. There is nothing to do with the religion conflict, but it's really the religions are used as a tool, of course, like have been used for centuries. Because we are all journalists here, I saw before some diplomats, maybe there are still some, but I think we shouldn't be formal. And there is a microphone there. What I will do is, the first one that want to ask a question, grab the microphone, and exactly, Nizar, thank you very much. Although I know that most of you, I will ask you to say your first name, last name, because there is somebody that is recording, somebody is reporting, and the publication, your affiliation, if you say the country, whatever you want to say, but when you ask the first questions, then you can, if you go with the second question, you can, and we can pass along the microphone. I think there is not need at the moment for me to moderate in the sense, no, you, because we are all, I think we are civilized enough.
Another thing, please, to speak very slowly because of the question. If you speak ancient Greek, maybe I can.
I'll not ask you in Arabic.
Thank you very much.
Nizar Aboud of Al Mayadeen Television in Lebanon. You spoke about this polarization around geopolitical matters in the Middle East and other areas. All these wars you linked it to geopolitical ambitions. And when you spoke about Iraq, you said it is Iran, Shiism and Sunnism, Saudi Arabia, and it is true there is leadership preference in Iran for the Shia, generally speaking. Some Shia, of course, in Pakistan, in Lebanon, in other areas, they don't associate themselves. Even Sistani in Iraq doesn't associate himself with Tehran or Qum. But in general, there is a majority of Shia identify themselves with the Iranian leadership or reference. That's to a large extent true. But you did not talk about geopolitics. Iraq has been occupied or invaded for over 13 years now, 12, 13 years. There are many other players in that region, and these players have their agenda, not necessarily religious, although George Bush, when he went to the Middle East, he spoke about crusades. We all remember that phrase. Is it enough to attribute that only to say that leadership vacancy has allowed different groups to go and fight everywhere? In Africa, we don't have Shia and Sunni. We have only Sunni. However, we have a lot of terrorism, more than in the Middle East, paradoxically speaking. North Africa is the main source of foreign fighters coming to Syria and Iraq. Does the economy do anything with that? Desertification, global warming, and other matters. Also, you did not touch on the issue of Judaism and Zionism. Zionism in the 19th, 20th century played a major role in creating a state called Israel. That state is at the heart of all the conflicts in the region. And obviously, I understand many Western writers are averse of writing about anything about Judaism or Zionism because they could be labeled as anti-Semitic. Are you one of them?
If I answer all your questions, I repeat what I wrote in the book. So this is another good advertisement for the book, because I say if you want to have all the answer, you buy the book. If you read Italian, you can buy it in Italian as well. Many questions. Of course, the first one is that I was very simple when I said Iran versus Saudi Arabia. Simple. It's a way I explain very rapidly when I don't have time, which was the case today. but you're right. There are many actors, and the issue is much more complicated because Turkey has its own ambitions and purposes in this area, and is playing a major role. You see what happened just yesterday, when the Kurds conquered the city. Then we have, of course, other local actors. Lebanon is one of them, because speaking of the conflict between Shia and Sunni, you are just in the middle of this conflict, and you have that at home. So I can understand that it is a particular hot issue for you. I wouldn't say, I would be a little more prudent about this identification between Shia and Iran and vice versa. Because Iran is very pragmatic, I would say. They use all the cards they can use, all of them. And I read, it was 3 or 4 days ago, an article on Wall Street Journal about the use of Taliban by Iran. I'm a little skeptical, but I wouldn't exclude, because Iran is very practical. We have to remind that Iran is one of the most ancient countries in the history of humanity. They have a long experience of political action accumulated, and they use this experience. Someone said also, and I mentioned in the book, that Shiism...
You go ahead, don't worry.
Okay. that Shiism in the Persian form was much more formed by the Persian experience than by the religious experience. The form of this particular clerical organization of Shiism in Iran is due much more to the history of Persia than the history of Islam. I don't know, because, of course, this is something I'm not specialist in, but there are specialists who say that. And on the other hand, Shiism is not so only the particular form they have in Iran, in South Iraq, and in Lebanon, which is just one form of Shiism. It's a 12er Shiism, which is different, for example, the Shiism that exists in Yemen. And in Yemen, at the very beginning, they were not really allied. The Houthi there were not really allied with Iran. It became little by little. And I don't know, actually, it's very difficult to say at which extent Iran is implied in the Yemeni affair. I think it is, because, as I told you, Iran is playing with different cards. And I wouldn't be surprised that they could use a part of Taliban, not all of them, because when you're talking about Taliban, you are talking about something very different, you know. But they could use them because it's a card. If they can have one more card in their hands, we can be sure that they will use. And then there is the other point you mentioned, which is very important, and I underlined it very much in the book, and Brian mentioned as well in his presentation, is this leadership vacancy, which I call in different way, and I'm studying in different way. I call it a crisis of the nation state. The political form of the nation state is declining, and there are many studies about that. Problem is that people focus on the crisis of nation state in all the industrialized countries, like the United States, for example, or France, or Britain, or Germany. But the problem is essentially of these kind of countries that didn't attain the stage in which the political form of nation state can mature, but they create a political form of nation state just picking up the forms, picking up the laws, picking up the constitutions of the nation state, and try to apply to a reality which was not yet mature for a nation state. So when I hear about the failure of failed state, I am always a little skeptical, because I think there are much more failed states than states. And this is more and more true. So this leadership vacancy, as you called it, it's a very spread problem. And the more the state was artificial, the more you have this problem. Let's take the example of Iraq. Iraq is probably the best example in this area of a fake state, an artificial state, because it was created of three different parts which didn't have a common history: the southern part, Shia part, the central Sunni part, and the northern Kurdish part.
Ottoman history.
This is the Ottoman history, that's right, but when they were in the multinational empire, Ottoman Empire, it was different. Because in the multinational empire, they could coexist different peoples, different religions. It was organized in order to make them to coexist. In the national states, it's not possible. National state is the opposite of the multinational states, the multinational empires. So this creator was doomed to fail because it was too artificial to resist. And you know why it was created this way. Because British wanted to put together the oil fields of Basra with the oil fields of Mosul. So so we created only one state in which we can have both. The problem is that Mosul is the capital of a Kurdish region, and Basra is one of the most important cities of the Shia. And in the middle you have the Sunni part, which has much more historical link with Aleppo in Syria than with Baghdad, for example, or with Basra, for instance. So this is an example in the Middle East. In Africa, almost all the states have this problem. And so almost all the states were created on artificial basis. So we should be much more surprised when one state is successful than when one state is failing, especially in a time like now, which is a time of multipolar world. So the world is changing very rapidly, and I think that there are many people who still don't notice or don't want to notice it. The world today is not longer the world when there were the United States and the Soviet Union that decided everything for everybody. It's no longer the case. So you have a lot of new political actors which emerge and try to impose themselves using all the tools they can find around them. And one of them, and the most popular today, is religion. I tried to study the Boko Haram history very rapidly. I didn't go very further, but in any case, I am absolutely sure, studying what happened to this movement, that 20 or 30 years ago, Boko Haram would have been a Marxist-Leninist movement. Exactly for the same reasons, because at that time, that was the way to mobilize peoples. Today, it's much more practical to use religion, but the causes and the purposes are the same. You take the history of many movements in Africa several decades ago, and you can find that they gave birth to a lot of political Marxist-Leninist movements. So this is true for the leadership vacancies, true for the economic problems. Tunisia is comparatively the most important provider of so-called jihadists in Iran, and there is a non-resolved problem in Tunisia. They just tried to fix up a little bit the political situation, but not the real problems that provoked the revolution in 2010, 2011.
I know. No, the problem is this. I know that Nizar was coming out with such a, questions that were going to take a lot of space. But yeah, I want to make sure, I know that you have something else to say.
One point is not answered yet.
Israel.
No, I let him...
How it helped
Israel.
I let him continue. I didn't want to interrupt. Just want to tell you this. I want to do a plan. I want you to know our plan. Then probably we will not be able to go along or come to totally with the plan. But it's 10 to 6. So I suggest this. We give another 15, 20 minutes for questions. And then we will continue the discussion, maybe, with some cheese and wine, and there are also juice there, okay? So what I mean is I'm trying to figure out that we will be here another 20 minutes talking on the microphone.
No,
Okay.
it's just because I didn't want to seem to escape this question about Israel. I don't think that Israel is the heart of the conflict. I mean, it is another pretext which was used very much by the local actors, and the situation today is much more complicated than it was 20 years ago, especially because I think that the presence of the United States in the region and everywhere in the world faded. And Israel was protected in the last times, because you know that Israel was a creation of the Soviet Union at the origin. Then, lastly, was protected. It is still protected by the United States. But since the United States is fading, is weakening in the world, because United States is witnessing a relative decline of its strength in the world. So I think that Israel today needs to in French I use this word, I don't know, Middle Easternized. Yeah, thank you very much.
Middle Easternized.
It's a verb, it doesn't exist. I invented it.
Just put IZE at the end of Middle Eastern.
Okay. So become more and more an actor which play with the card of other powers in the Middle East, because it cannot count on the endless protection of the United States. They know that the United States is much less reliable than it was before. About this question about Judaism and Zionism, I fundamentally agree with you. I think that this is a misuse of this name of Zionism today. Zionism, I studied political movements, and I know pretty well what Zionism is. And there is a confusion I consider we should avoid between Zionism and Israel and Judaism. There are three different things. When I speak about Catholic Church, I am always told that I have not to confuse Catholic Church, Vatican, the Holy See, and the City of Vatican. 4 different things. I think that the difference between these 4 things are much less important than the difference between Zionism, Israel, and Judaism. So this is my opinion. But what I think is not Israel which is at the heart of conflict. Israel is a pretext for conflict in the region, and especially conflict among Arab powers. Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and then Iran, that all of them used this excuse of fighting against Israel in order to fight against each other and establish the hegemony of one of them on the other ones. This is what I learned by history.
Okay, good. So Nizar has the microphone, and he's going to pass it to somebody else, Masoud, and he's going to, okay. Masoud, your name, your last name, and everything.
My name is, of course, Masoud.
No.
Thank you, sir. Yes. Thank you. My name is Masood Haider. I represent Daily Dawn newspaper of Pakistan over here. My overall observation and
Keep the microphone.
in my opinion, what Professor Mr. Knowlton said, and he was very right on when he talked about religion becoming predominant in the Middle Eastern after the Ayatollah Khomeini's into Iran and taking over, and also because of the fear that in the Iranian sphere, in particular, that the United States is playing a role in case of what do you call overthrow of this government and so forth. And then it came about that Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini came on the scene and he became a dominant. And that as compared to, sorry, like that. That compared to, then comes Saudi Arabia and the Sunni influence and their vision for Middle East. And then came the Syrian war and the Arab Spring and everything else at the same time. So I certainly think that religion started becoming predominant in the Middle Eastern. I mean, it was dominant, but became very, very dominant, because when I was living in Pakistan, the religion was not as dominant as it is now there. When I was living, there was no, I mean, at least it was never no pronounced Shia-Sunni problems. Now it is. So all this has changed since Ayatollah Khomeini coming in, and then of course Saudi Arabia flexing his muscles, and also other countries. But the thing is, now it is becoming more and more a sort of a confrontation between Saudi Arabia, supposedly the Sunni faction, and Iran, which is being touted as the Shia faction. And you were right when you said that the Houthis or in the Yemen fact do not have any basic alliances with Iran. Absolutely, but it doesn't seem that way. But they are being told, no, you are being supported by Iran, so forth. So what do you think in that context? What do you think that Mr. Brian Knowlton basically pointing out correctly, that influence, religion came into being as a consequence of Ayatollah Khomeini's dominance in the region? So what do you think overall, how all this is unfolding, and how is Shia and Sunni conflict will somehow manifest itself now?
Yes, try to be very rapid. I think that Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolution of 1979 in Iran is at the same time an effect and a cause of what is going on today. An effect because the atmosphere was already impregnated of a religion. There was already a religious atmosphere that brought Khomeini to the power. Without this atmosphere, it would have been impossible for Khomeini to conquer the power. So this is, I would say, an effect. I say, more or less, the scholars I studied put the beginning of this new era in the mid-70s. So in this situation in Iran was a particular situation of a very, very rapid economic development, with many people coming from the countryside and going to work in the big cities, especially Tehran, of course. And they were very religious people, because in the countryside were religious. So they brought to the city their religious beliefs. So when they found this revolution, when there was this revolution, they found their natural leaders in the mullah and ayatollah. So he was an effect of this new atmosphere, but it was also a cause, because after the victory of the Iranian Revolution, which was called an Islamic Revolution afterward, was called like that, many people thought that it was possible to transform their societies by the same means. And it's interesting to notice that the first group that tried to imitate, even though they formally condemned Khomeini because they were fundamentalist Sunni, but they acted exactly in the same way with the same purposes, were a group of terrorists which in November, December 1979, I don't remember exactly the month, attacked the Mecca and seized them. And was? Yeah. And that was the first Muslim terror attack ever in the 19th century, in the 20th century, of course. And
just one thing that I just wanted to add, which I forgot to add, was the influence, the advent of this war and the so-called war in Afghanistan war, which brought about all these religious factions together to fight against Russia. Mm-hmm. That had the most
of course, and you'll see that in my book there is a big part consecrated
devoted
to the
Iranian, because that galvanized the so-called extremist Islam.
And in the book I use a formula. I would say that the first holy war in the 20th century was proclaimed by an American Catholic from Polish origins, was Brzezinski. So it's interesting because it was a Muslim holy war proclaimed by the Polish Catholic, American Polish Catholic. So it's pretty paradoxical, but it is the reality of the things. So it's true that the war in Afghanistan opened, you say, Pandora box, and then it was impossible to put again everything in, because this idea mixed with besides the Iranian Revolution and this idea that was the victory of Afghan Mujahideen was a victory of God against the godless people, godless army, make these Mujahideen think that they were, since they had God on their side, that they could win everywhere. That was the origin of the spread of these fake invented revolution, Islamic revolutions in the world.
Nizar, can you pass the microphone to if there is there?
Thank you very much. You've raised
the name.
Carlos Day, Global Research. You've raised a Pandora's box of questions. I have at least two questions to ask you. Since you've mentioned Mr. Brzezinski, you're probably familiar with his book, The Grand Chessboard, and it appears as though his use of Islam was for almost exclusively political purposes. And can you comment upon the fact that the government, prior to Brzezinski's, quote, success, close quote, Najibullah, mandated education for boys and girls, and that women held the highest positions in government ministries. So it was actually a very evolved, perhaps this is Western thinking, but evolved society, and that what has occurred as a result of the use of radical Islam in the Middle East and now in Africa. In fact, this was detailed in a book you're probably also familiar with, Dreyfus's book, Devil's Game, How the U.S. Helped Unleash Islamic Radical Islam. The use of the Muslim Brotherhood historically, going back the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran and the attempt to overthrow Nasser in Egypt. Every progressive country in the Middle East there have been attempts to undermine them and destroy their independence using religious extremism. And the second thing I would like to ask you, can you comment upon liberation theology in Latin America? Because I would see that there is your equation of the Marxist-Leninist movements with Boko Haram seem to be a bit, what can I say, of a stretch, because I had worked in Latin America during the periods of the military, and I know that the Marxist movements, for example, protected people. They did not use people as, what can I say, for example, they might send a message to Dow Chemical evacuate your building, we're going to blow it up, but we don't want anybody to get hurt. And a large portion of the Catholic Church in Latin America supported this. What would you say? And of course, the Vatican wasn't happy about this. On the other hand, these Islamic extremist movements slaughter people first and then state their goals afterward. So this seems to be quite a distortion of religion all the way around. I realize this is a fairly large question.
Yeah.
As journalists with big questions all the time.
I cannot say anything about distortion of religions because, as I told at the beginning, I don't know which is the right or wrong. It's not my job. And there are many, many theologians in the world that they fight against each other to establish what is right and what is wrong. And it's not my job. I just talk about geopolitics. And you're right about the use of religious extremism in order to attain political objectives, but not always things not always went in the only one direction. Because, for example, in the 50s, when the United States for the first time started very slowly studying the Muslim world, because they didn't know anything about the Muslim world, they found among the group who was studying, there were a group very hostile to Islam. Not for the same reasons of today, but because they thought that Islam was intrinsically too close. The idea of justice, which was behind the idea of Sharia, was too close to Marxism. So they, in the book, I know that you will buy it, but you'll find all the quotations about this research. And it's interesting to find that there was people that say, at the time said, don't get too close to Islam because Islam could be a natural ally of the Soviet Union. For this reason of the thirst of justice that it was inside, and it was the same rhetorics of the Soviet Union. So some people used the religious extremism against, you're right, the case of Mossadegh is one of the most famous one, but it was not only one way. There was also different positions about it. About the Latin America, you studied much better than I, so you know better than me what was the situation. But what you were talking not about the liberation theology movement, which was very a small movement, but about the forms that was used at that time from a particular group of people in Latin America, and today used by other people in Africa, for example. And of course, the forms of their fight are completely different, and we cannot compare them. I'm not comparing them, and I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the method of Boko Haram would be different if they were a Marxist-Leninist movement. I'm just saying that they are using a popular ideology, which can move people, can help them to recruit people. And today this ideology is a religious one, and 30 years ago would have been a political one. I say Marxist-Leninist because at the time all the liberation movements called themselves Marxist-Leninist. In any case, even in South America you have another counter-example, which is the counter-example of the guerrilla in Colombia. In Colombia, I wouldn't say that they were so gentle in their war against the government. They call themselves Marxist. I don't think they are Marxist. They don't think that any liberation movement in the world at the time was really Marxist, but this is not a thing. But in any case, they still call themselves Marxist. And I don't think that the methods are, yes, they are different, but not that different from methods used in other parts of the world. We can mention another one, which is the Tiger Tamil Liberation Front. Even in the case, you have a massacre of peoples just because they were Sinhalese and not Tamil at the time. So I wouldn't compare very much this form, and I wouldn't mix up all the things together. I mean, one is Catholic, the other one is Hinduist, the other one is Muslim. You see, even the political form of the struggles, alas, change, and not always toward better forms.
We have time for another couple of questions. Please keep it short. Yes. Linda.
My question will be short. I was very interested.
Name, Linda. Say
Oh,
your
I'm sorry,
name.
Linda Fasulo. I represent NPR here at the UN. I was just wondering, I thought it was very interesting what you said, that you didn't think that Israel was the central issue, within the context of the conflict in the Middle East. Can you possibly expand upon that?
As I told you, Israel, of course, there is a problem at the origin of the creation of Israel. But if you study the history of Israel, you notice that more or less what happened in 1947, 1948 was something brought by the international relations at the time. The issue, the result, the outcome of the World War II, of course, with the situation of Jews in Europe, with a big mass of people leaving Europe and trying to find another countryside, just another country, sorry. With the decline in British Empire, which used for several decades Arabs and Jews against each other in order to remain in this area, a purpose which was fundamentally linked to the possession of India, because we can say that Middle East is the gate of India. Coming from Mediterranean, you have to pass through the Middle East if you want to go to India. This is one of the reasons why Britons were so interested in controlling this area. But in 1947, India became independent. Pakistan became independent. So this priority didn't exist anymore. And on the other side, you had the Soviet Union and the United States. We were objectively allied in pushing away all the former colonial powers, so pushing away Britain from Palestine, from everywhere in the world actually, and France at the same time, or Dutch from Indonesia or whatever. Actually, Israel was not a creation of Zionism. Israel was a creation of the Soviet Union with the alliance of the United States. So, and this is a fundamental misunderstanding, which is, of course, cultivated in Israel by officials, that Israel is the creation of the Zionist movement. No, it's the creation of international relations. It's a consequence, it's an outcome of international relations. And more or less, when Russia, I just made a conference, a lecture in France about the creation of Israel. And so I found a very interesting article published in L'Humanité, the paper of the Communist Party, French Communist Party, in which they reproduced the official document of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was supporting Israel during the war in 1948, not just sending weapons, because they sent weapons through Czechoslovakia, but also mobilizing people in Europe to support the cause of Israel. So they didn't care a thing about the Arabs at that time. But at the same time, you have to notice that the Palestinian refugees, so-called the Palestinian refugees, are one of the most ancient population which still live in camps. You have, at the end of World War II, millions of people. Just for speaking of Germans, you have 13 million of Germans, refugees, expelled by their countries. And all of them, little by little, even with dramatic circumstances, even with 1 million people dead in this displacement, but all of them found, finally, eventually, a new house, a new country. Why Palestinians did not? Simply because nobody wanted to accept them, because they preferred to have a Palestinian living in the camp, suffering, and being exploited by everything, because they could always say, we are defending the Palestinian cause. If the Palestinian cause don't exist anymore, they don't have anything to defend. So they are losing an arm, a weapon in their political action. And since these countries, as I told, are essentially artificial countries, they need to find something that unify themselves, because they don't exist as a country. This idea that they are nation states is a fiction. They are not a nation state. They don't have a national identity. Same thing, I know.
Go ahead.
On the Israeli side, because Israel, you know, when it was created, it was an Ashkenazi country. Majority of population was, how do you say, Sephardi? Sephardic. But they were called the Jewish with the blue eyes that were ruling Israel. And it was for several decades like that. And when the situation, and the working class were Arabs, essentially. Things changed when the Soviet Union collapsed. And at the time, there was a massive immigration from Russia, and this massive immigration from Russia became the new working class. So Arabs could be exported. They closed the borders. Arabs, remember, they came from different countries, and they went to work in Israel, and then they came back to their country. They closed the borders because they had their own working class. So now, at that time, they had to invent a new national identity, because the original national identity, which was Ashkenazi, couldn't go on because it was changed. Of course, they were Ashkenazi as well, but they were not the same Ashkenazi that arrived in 1947. They were totally different. They were Ashkenazi who remained for years and years under the Soviet Union and different countries of the Soviet Union area. So it was completely different. And this new identity is founded on fear. We have enemies. We are surrounded by enemies. And this is something that compacts the population, to find a cohesion of the population. And if you don't entertain this fear all the time, you risk to make Israel to explode. So this is why, just to go a little further. Sorry.
One quick question.
Wait a minute, Nissan. You're going to do the one quick question at the end, because is anybody else? No? Okay, then I do the question, didn't do it yet, and then you do. Okay, let me just ask. No, I have to ask a question because I want to take advantage of having me here. This is about geopolitics more than religion. And it's to do with the ISIS. Actually, it's to do with IS, or I have to do with ISIL. And this is something, a question that I ask here in this building, and I ask it directly to the spokesperson of the Secretary General. And I'm trying to ask this question to the ambassador, US ambassador, but she's not so available in asking questions. But the question is, this was called ISIS for some time, and everybody here was calling ISIS. And then all of a sudden, it started to be called ISIL with an L, Levant. And I asked, how come the UN changed the name the way you call it? And Stefan, the spokesperson of the Secretary General, answered me, we are not deciding, it's the Security Council deciding. That month that was changed the name, the presidency was a US presidency. It was Samantha Power was the president.
But IS is also, they themselves call themselves IS.
You see, I'm an expert on mafia. I found myself, that's why I wrote a book and everything. Mafia doesn't call itself mafia. Mafia calls itself another name. Cosa Nostra, they call them men of honor, so on. Mafia is the way it's called by the others. It's always important to check the way the others, the so-called formal or informal enemy calls you, okay? So I want to know, and the question is, why the United States wanted, and still today, you can see the New York Times, they call it ISIS. You go in the article of New York Times, they write ISIS, and then they interview somebody from the State Department, they call them ISIL, and the New York Times tell the government of the United States call it ISIL. Practically they change from Islamic State of Iraq and Syria to Islamic State of... No, United States. This is the way ISIS call itself. I'm talking about how the United States call ISIS. It called Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. Iraq and Levant. Levant, if I know my geography, is a little bit bigger than Syria. Because Levant goes to Lebanon. And Levant goes even to Cyprus if you want. Levant goes all, so United States about 7 or 8 months ago started to call ISIS, when it was only, at that time, only in Syria and Iraq, started to call it like it was bigger. My question is, I'm trying to ask these questions, they don't answer to me. The person that answered me was the spokesperson that said, we are not the one to decide the name. I found out that it's the United States that kind of used this name. Do you think there is a kind of a geopolitical strategy to call them ISIL instead than ISIS?
This is a big question. You see, I don't have a blonde hair, so you can take me for Samantha Power. And I don't know. I know that this is something behind the use of the names, because in France, for example, they call them État Islamique, Islamic State. That's it. Now they are starting using the Arabic acronym, Daesh. But I tried to understand why in France they use Islamic State, which is the way they call themselves. It seems that they want to confirm that they are representing the Islamic State really. So for the French point of view, I have some doubt, but for the United States, really, I am not able to tell you. In any case, for me, speaking of names, the very idea of a state is misleading, because what they wanted to do is not a state. It's something that goes beyond the state. So and it's interesting because this fundamentalism, this so-called Islamic fundamentalism, is using much more political tools created in 19th and 20th century in the West than political tool found in the experience of Muhammad in the 7th century. So they say of themselves, we are going back to the 7th century because there was the time of purity and so on. And then they invented state. State didn't exist at that time. And other political forms didn't exist. The same thing in Iran. In Iran, they wanted to go back to the 7th century, and then they have a president of republic, parliament, elections, and so on. All things that didn't exist at that time. So there is a little bit paradoxical, the very fact that they call themselves a state, whatever Islam, whatever Syria, Levant, or Islamic State, that's it.
Nizar.
Okay, quick questions here. Of course, Israel was first promised to be a state was by Lord Balfour, who was a descendant of Rothschilds, one thing. Another thing is that in the 50s, you did not touch upon Islamists and Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb and their affiliation with Britain and counter Nasser, which was a very important state. At that time, also, the coup d'etat in Iran against Mossadegh, coincidentally, and the Pact of Baghdad, which was similar or extension of the CENTO, where Pakistan was with Lebanon and Iraq and others were compiled together in one pact in order to counter revolutionaries or republicans. When Khomeini came to power in 1979, the Wahhabis suddenly realized that it's time to propagate their creed everywhere by building mosques, madrasas everywhere in the world, from Latin America down to the Philippines. And this was with the blessing of the CIA and others, because they wanted to counter Khomeini and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. This is a chapter probably you'd not touch upon, and today we see that ISIS and Al-Nusra Front both fight in the Golan alongside the Israelis, with the protection of the Israelis, who interfere sometimes with weapons, direct artillery shelling, and sometimes by airstrikes. These fundamentalists or Islamic are predominantly Wahhabi everywhere, and they are in alliance with the West. And there are many books and many writers who wrote, including in the New York Times and others, about the affiliation between ISIS and the Western intelligence in the West. Did you find anything related to that in any way? This Western fundamentalist Wahhabi relationship?
I don't know if they have people within. I think they have, because they have to control them, so they send people in these organizations. But the problem I studied is a historical problem. Of course, the Wahhabism was successful thanks to the United Kingdom. It was the British that brought the Saudi house to conquer all the Saudi peninsula, of the Arab peninsula. So there is the original sin, if you want, was there. Then everybody thought that it was so simple to use Wahhabism, included the Saudi Arabian themselves, of course. But originally, they were successful thanks to the support of Great Britain. British protected Saudi, protected the Wahhabi preachers in Kuwait when Turkey reconquered this region from them. And then after World War I, they sent them back to conquer the entire peninsula. So you were mentioning Lord Balfour, but Lord Balfour is the same country in which they, on one side they proclaimed the national home, the Jewish national home, in 1917, and on the other side they supported Wahhabi. And even in Palestine, you remember the issue of the Mufti of Jerusalem. The Mufti of Jerusalem was, I don't remember his name, Husseini, exactly. Perfect, thank you very much. He was a creator of Britons again, because when it was time to elect a new Mufti, Husseini was fourth in the elections. And the British picked him up and put him at this position. Was a kind of an endorsement, more than an endorsement. They decided to put him there. And why the three who was before him was three representatives of another clan in Jerusalem, and they led the city of Jerusalem, for example, which were favorable to the coexistence between Arabs and Jewish. So when they decided to choose Husseini, it was because they wanted immediately to insert something between to make Arabs and Jewish fight against each other. Husseini had been condemned just 1 year before for having promoted the first pogrom against the Jewish in Palestine. And despite that, it was condemned by a British court. Despite them, they decided to put him at the head of the Muslim population. So it's a long story, and it's not today they started playing with the religious actor in order to put them against each other.
If it's okay for you, we are done. We can continue our conversations with a glass of wine, of juice, if you want. There is cheese and other stuff. I just want to say this. I want to thank Professor Graziano for this conversation. that I think what is make the good user for us journalists, is that whenever problem we see, we are trained to not believe what usually the authority or whoever has a stake in the moment tells you, because they of course do a lot of spinning. They have to take, they have to put up their side of the story. And this happens not only in situation has to do with today, but this is to do also with history. Also when States all over, and we're not talking only Middle East. I just want to do a very little parenthesis and I'll leave you to the cheese and wine. When you were recounting, say, like Israel, how it was born, or other things, it reminds me like Italy. We have the big idea that Garibaldi, these heroes with patriots, were able to conquer Sicily to make it unified with 1,000 men. Well, then you find out why the British ships were in front of Palermo protecting it, and I don't go on, but just this means that history is not what history books for schools tell you, but is something that you need analytical skills to find out, a lot of work, and I think Professor Graziano gave us an example of what it means. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I open right away because unfortunately